Hello team and welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan at MSP. This is a quick stats update using Dell's spreadsheet that is available in the description below. It is open source, as in you can look at it. Please do so, and thank you so much to Dell for keeping this up. I haven't dipped into this for some time, so I'm going to do this, particularly as someone in the comments put an updated comment as to what had been lost in August. And this is concerning Ukrainian general staff figures, and all the caveats do apply to them. They might not be accurate, might be propagandist, they might, I don't know, there might be some issues with them in many different ways, but they're what we've got, and I strive to see whether they are indeed at least somewhat accurate, and I think they are. Anyway, Michael Hertig says here, I promise to update August figures to the end of the month. Personnel 16,830, tanks 225, APVs 416, artillery 691, MLRS 34, anti-aircraft 40, aircraft 3, helicopters 5, drones 400, cruise missiles 102, trucks and fuel tanks 684, and special equipment 115. So let's go and see where this fits in to the data as a whole. So you can see all the raw data that Dell has input into his spreadsheet, and then we're going to check it in and see what it looks like in terms of the graph. I'm going to move my head up there for obvious reasons. Oh look, I'm flying. Right. Okay. So personnel, we can see that there was this purple patch for the Ukrainians here, where there were huge Russian losses, up to 1,140 on the worst day there. That's going to be the middle of the Bakhmut the Bakhmut offensive from the Russian side of things. But also, you have some spikes around here. October. This is going to be the Kherson and Kharkiv counteroffensives that took place at various times along this sort of period of time there. But yeah, it then went down after Bakhmut sort of cooled down a little bit and went up a little bit. You can see a spike here at the beginning of the counteroffensive. So that's end of May, beginning of June. And that's dropped down. We have some spikes, but actually it seems that the front line has come down apart from particular points that are particularly hot along the front line. When you look at the blue line there, that is your overall losses, and the steeper the line, the greater the losses. It represents, higher losses. So you can see it's steeper here as it's taking into account the spike in Russian losses, and then trails off a little bit, then goes up. There's a little bit steeper there to reflect these. Then you see also the trend line, this orange dotted line being a trend line there. So that's you've got personnel in daily totals, running total, poly, and 7-day moving average is the green line that you can see shows the kind of daily, reflects the dailies somewhat there. So the orange trend line is kind of going downwards from the height of the Bakhmut losses there. So tanks, we can see there were some times of really huge losses. May last year, this is when the Russians were going into Ukraine and then realizing that they were coming across some quite stiff resistance, and you had convoys of vehicles that were blown up. Bayraktars were being used for, you had javelins being used aplenty, and the Russians were taking huge losses. And then when you had the Kharkiv counteroffensive, particularly, a lot of equipment was lost by the Russians, and obviously Kherson as well. So that explains that area, and it's fairly quiet since then. And now I think you've got just consistent losses that are taking place on a daily basis, and that's what I try and communicate to you. It's slightly greater losses, I think, than previously. Certainly in sort of April and into May, and we started June onwards. It started getting a bit heavier. APVs. Fairly consistent. I mean, we see some really huge losses on a daily basis, but actually, what's interesting there is that's not particularly unusual. Just across this war, the Russians have lost an absolute bucket load of APVs. So your infantry fighting vehicles, mine-resistant ambush protection vehicles, and armored personnel carriers. Now, again, right, but it's very similar to tanks. Right at the beginning of the war, they lost an absolute bucket load of these. Then in the counteroffensives, lost a load more, and then since then, it's been fairly consistent. Last week, a bit of a drop, but we saw yesterday some high numbers. So it is. I think it's fairly consistently bad for the Russians, but that's it's no different from say the last 6 months. Now, artillery, I think, is where we can see a really significant difference over the course of the counteroffensive. So yeah, they lost some kind of heavy bits of they had some heavy artillery losses around the Kherson and Kharkiv counteroffensives, uh, but essentially what you have seen since April is a massive attempt to degrade the Russian artillery, and a huge success there. As you can see, the blue line uh, really takes on a much steeper gradient, come April, and that is continuing. So they are just losing vast numbers of artillery, and that is part of the I don't know if you can say doctrine. It's part of the strategy that's going on with the Ukrainians now. They attacked, they lost some vehicles, they regrouped. This is the Ukrainians, and then they said, right, we don't have air support. We need to hammer the Russian artillery. So we are going to just sit back. We'll probe in a few places: Velika Novosilka, Robotna, maybe a bit around Piatykhaki near Vasilivka, and a few places. But generally, we're going to sit back and attrit from afar using our own ranged ordnance like HIMARS, and then the Panzerhaubitze 2000s, Caesars, and all these kind of self-propelled guns and M777s that have a greater range than the Russian artillery, and we can degrade and do the job of an air force that would have superiority, if it had superiority, would do that job, but we'll have to do it with our ground forces and artillery, and that does take a lot longer to achieve. And so this has been, you can see from I guess April through to now, so that's a good like 5 months, I guess, 4 months particularly, of doing activity that, if you had air supremacy, probably could have been done within 1 month, and it's still really not finished. So the Russians just have a huge amount of artillery. But yeah, that's the story that graph tells you. Right, moving on to MLRS, I think you can see a bit of an increase in multiple launch rocket systems, your Grads and Smerches. They've been fairly consistent across, I mean, peaks and troughs, but as you can see from the orange dotted line, it's fairly consistent, and then sort of went up, dropped in the last few weeks maybe, but has gone up during the counteroffensive as Ukraine has targeted some of those vehicles, because rather like the artillery, well, they are sort of forms of artillery, aren't they? So it's part of that approach of degrading the Russian artillery so that they can eventually break through and do their proper counteroffensive combined arms maneuvers. But yeah, I wonder whether the dip tells you anything recently, whether the Russians are running a bit low on this. I mean, I was talking about how tanks, you're maybe seeing fewer tanks than you might have seen at other times during the war, just because they have fewer tanks. But and I think that's possibly the case. The Russians are using them more cautiously, but also it's looking at the types of tanks that get lost. So generally, older tanks are getting lost at the moment, which might indicate that the Russians just don't have their newer tanks, or again, they are using them more cautiously. Right, when we look at anti-aircraft warfare systems, this is again fits in with artillery. It's the same approach. It's this distance approach to degrading the Russian defenses, or the artillery and air defenses, so that they can then do their normal counter-offensive maneuvers, and that might involve airframes. And you're not going to bring airframes to the front if the Russians have really good air defense. Well, actually, you can see the number of air defense systems being taken out is significantly higher than at any previous time in the war. Yes, there were some losses around the time of the Kharkiv and the Kherson counteroffensives and at the beginning of the war, but really this is a purple patch for the Ukrainians. You can see that by the steeper blue line as well. aircraft being lost. This is slightly more difficult. These are fixed wing aircraft. Really, not many losses at all over the last few months. A lot lost at the beginning. This tells the story that we already know, that the Russians weren't really, the Russians didn't do their suppression of enemy air defense or destruction of enemy air defense activities at the beginning of the war nearly effectively enough. As a result, 80% of the Ukrainian aircraft were still operational, and the air defenses were still mainly operational. So then they used their airframes a whole bunch, and then lost a load, and then said, right, okay, we're not going to do that. And since then, really, with a couple of exceptions on a few days here and there, they've used their airframes, their air force, really, really cautiously. Precisely because they didn't do the suppression of enemy air defense effectively enough. Helicopters, they've lost a few more, I guess, around here. There's a little uptick there as the counteroffensive was bringing out the Russian Ka-52 attack helicopters to try and help their ground troops, the Russian ground troops, by taking out Ukrainian mechanized equipment, but they did lose a number. And I don't know whether I didn't mention a couple of weeks ago where I thought the Ka-52s had started being a little bit thinner on the ground or in the air. We're seeing them as slightly less, but there is still footage out there of them. I showed you some today, in fact. So again, it's do they? Well, it's are they using them more cautiously as with the fixed wing aircraft, but also they have lost a lot of Ka-52 particularly, so somewhere between like 30% and maybe even 50% of their Ka-52 fleet have been attrited, and that would include crew members as well. So uh, the question is, yeah, yeah, okay, they're using more cautiously maybe, but are they also suffering from not having enough of those airframes, uh, that are battle ready, or enough crews to be able to crew them? And that's why you're seeing fewer losses than you might expect. I don't know. Open questions. Drone usage from the Russians, it peaked around May time. This would be the larger Shahed drones, not really any other types, just the larger ones. I don't know whether it includes Lancets. It might do, and some of the larger reconnaissance drones. But yeah, you see an uptick there, and then a little bit further on. But they are using a lot of the Shahed drones. They seem to be using them as they get them. But a drop recently, and I wonder if that tells you anything about a lack of stock of them. As you can see, these steeper areas here, there's the three elements of steepness, and at the beginning, I think this probably tells you a picture here that the Russians received a stockpile of Shahed drones there, maybe there and here, and then they receive them, they use them, and they use them in tandem, maybe with cruise missiles that have, uh, again, fairly similar, although the lines are obviously a lot thinner. They're not using these as consistently. The big thing about cruise missiles is why were they having saturation attacks of like 120 missile and drone attacks? Why were they using up to 120 odd units then, and why are they not using them now? And the only plausible explanation is they just don't have as many of them, because they still have the same needs, right? They're still in a war, and they still need to hit the Ukrainian. It's not like they've finished, like I said the other day, and they've done that. It's like, brilliant, right? I finished. We finished blowing that stuff up. There's no need to do it again. So we only need to use half the missiles, because actually we've done that, and they ain't coming back. They've rebuilt the energy infrastructure. Military targets have occasionally been hit, but it's mainly civilian target. You've still got the same needs to hit targets that you had back here, right? And yet, in fact, possibly even more. So there's military equipment, greater amount of NATO military equipment, all sorts that's in place, and you've got staging bases, and you've got this and that. Why are you not using as many cruise missiles and as many drones as you were back then? Again, it's because you are running low, and you're using these at the rate that you are constructing them, is my guess, or at the rate that you are importing them from Iran. Uh, Otherwise, you would see that pattern continue all the way through. And there was the argument that here they knew there's a counteroffensive going to take place, so they were stockpiling them here for a greater use. And you can see they did use them to a greater degree here than maybe in April, in sort of March and April. Um, that day withstanding, notwithstanding. So this could be a case of stockpiling the productions, the low productions they had, to use them to a greater degree in the counteroffensive. And then I think when you had like this day, the other day, I wonder whether the Russians would have used those 28 cruise missiles against Kiev. Why would you have used them then? Why did you use them then? Well, that was a revenge attack because the Ukrainians had hit Pskov with drones, etc., and Bryansk, etc., etc. I'm wondering whether they really didn't want to use those 28. Actually, that was a revenge attack where they sacrificed 28 missiles to the Ukrainian Kiev air defenses. Uh, I'm fairly sure that that was just a knee-jerk reaction, and actually, from a strategic point of view, they want to keep those because they just don't have enough of them. Anyway, that's that. Vehicle and fuel tanks would be the last one to look at, which I think is a significant category. And although it doesn't look like a big change there, we saw the big columns of vehicles getting taken out at the beginning of the war. Then that sort of dropped down. There were some spikes around here about just coming up to the counter-offensives there of last year. But I think this, although it's quite gradual, this is actually really significant. So there's a slight increase in the steepness of the gradient there to reflect that they are just losing really significant numbers of vehicles. And when you look at the exact types of vehicles, they're starting to lose a lot of civilian vehicles, and that's because they've run out of military vehicles. We've seen train loads back around this time when they were getting trains, coming in from Russia with like 1950s lorries on, trucks on. That showed you that they are getting low on those on military hardware for logistics, and so they're having to rely on civilian hardware now. And you're starting to see on a daily basis just a huge number of civilian pieces of kit getting taken out. And I think that uptick of the trend line there is really significant and will, I think, be reflected in a lack of ability to logistically support their own troops on the defense line, on right across their defensive lines. Yeah, so that's just a little analysis of Dell's data. Thank you so much, Dell, for that. You are a legend. Really, really appreciate that. Thank you for Michael for counting up the month losses as well. Hopefully that's useful. Take care, and I'm going to go on with my frontline update now.